Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we turn our attention to the environment and to the contradiction between the environment being both habitat and wilderness, and the issues that need to be solved when humans encroach on wilderness in terms of entertainment and sport, and the wilderness suffers thereby. And the attempts on the part of many organizations over the decades, actually, to try to strike a balance. So today we're going to have a good friend of mine, Scott Penzarella, who is living up in Oregon, who is a co-founder of the Sisters Alliance there that is trying to work out an equilibrium whereby wilderness is preserved and humanity's recreation in the wilderness is also preserved. So, Scott, I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising. And why don't you first start by giving us a little bit more about your background, which is very diverse and successful. He's a relentless entrepreneur, and how you ended up in Oregon and how you got involved with the Sisters Earth Alliance.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim. Really happy to be here. Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Penzarella. As Jim mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Sisters Trail Alliance in Sisters, Oregon, an organization I joined about a year and a half ago, who's been doing work in and around federal and wilderness area for a couple of decades. And I came to this organization by way of, as Jim mentioned, a passion for the outdoors, for sport and recreation. And what I used to believe was doing my part to preserve nature and wildlife by being a recreationist, as an outdoor enthusiast. And my background is, as Jim mentioned, nearly 20 years in small business, a lot of different entrepreneurial ventures, which always included as a side passion, a passion for the outdoors, playing, if you will, in our natural places, visiting national parks, enjoying some of our national lands. And I came to Sisters and Sisters Trail Alliance with the goal of blending some of my business passion and my passion for the outdoors and looking at it with a cold eye in a new way. That is to say, I realized that recreations are having a larger and sometimes deleterious effect on the wilderness and our outdoor wild places and wild lands. And I wanted to take a more responsible approach to being a recreationist. And that's really what we talk about now at the Alliance, is how to protect and preserve the outdoor experience and be really conscientious of how we recreationists are impacting those areas, which sometimes includes, and we'll go into some details about what it means to not go into wilderness or to not go into wild places when you know that you're having these negative impacts.
Well, thank you. Well, let's jump right in with the news of today. Shannon MacArthur just put in the chat a report from Banff, a national park in Canada, where a bear killed 2 people, and that follows on an incident, a similar incident in the United States last week, where a bear killed someone. And so I think we're in a period of time, Scott, where in some ways nature is fighting back. You may recall that last year there were many, many reports of whales and sharks attacking boats out in the ocean, sharks attacking, killing surfers and swimmers in Australia and so forth. So I think the boundary line that you're talking about has been pushed so far in the direction of indiscriminate human encroachment that the wildlife, wherever they are, even in preserves. I was just watching a documentary about a tiger reserve in India, where they were pointing out that the tigers normally, roam freely over hundreds of miles, and they're stuck in this little preserve that's, I think, 10 miles by 20 miles. And it's also been used by people. And then guess what? The tiger killed one of the rangers. And so the impulse always is like they did in the United States last week, to kill the bear. And in India, they took the tiger, captured it, and put it in a little cage.
Yeah.
And so far it hasn't been released. And there's a whole movement in India to release this tiger. So speak to us a little bit about, what's going on with these instances, and how Sisters Trail Alliance is breaking new ground, because it's not an easy conundrum to solve.
Yeah, that's right. No, it's a really interesting, it's a stark reminder that coexistence is really important. And we have truly failed, particularly in this country, to coexist with wildlife everywhere you look. We extirpate wild animals whenever we can. We have wildlife services, and that's its name, that's killing millions and millions of animals every year in America because they're nuisance animals or because they've killed or disturbed something. We talk a lot about how, as recreationists, we have a really important voice that many don't realize we have. That is to say, we're not just environmentalists or conservationists. We're recreationists who care about conservation and the environment. And therefore, we need to speak out on behalf of the environment and the wild lands and the wild species that exist there. And we have to be much more responsible in acknowledging that we are treading on their land, that we are one with animals, that we are not superior, dominating human beings, but rather we are one with nature. And it's really hard to convince the recreation community that we have to sometimes pull back. We can't continue to expand our footprint everywhere, and that we have to be more conscientious of perhaps containing our footprint in many areas where we know we're having negative impacts. Coexistence is critical. We're seeing wildlife loss in our area in Deschutes County in Central Oregon in the tune of 60–70% of mule deer loss in just 10 years. And to say that recreationists aren't part of that loss is really being naive. We have to acknowledge that when we hike, bike, walk with our dogs, particularly off leash, when we wander in wilderness in groups and make noise, we're having real impact. And we need to talk about that, and we need to make change in a way that we can learn how to coexist. There's plenty of great examples of coexistence. We're not doing it particularly well yet, but we strive to do better at coexistence, because I think it's a real shame to hear these stories of large swaths of America losing its biodiversity and its wildlife as a result of human impacts. And some are as benign as that, as walking with your dog off leash that's uncontrolled, and it's scaring mule deer. It prevents them from procreating. They are dispersed in a way that they wouldn't normally be dispersed. These are things that are happening every day. And I recognize that I have an opportunity to take these people who care and become more active and activists in preserving those wild creatures in wild places.
Yeah. Now, tell us a little bit more about what the Sisters Trails Alliance is actually doing in detail around this matter. And also, I mean, as you frame that, talk to us about any examples that you know out there of organizations or areas of the world where they're doing it correctly.
Well, it's a good question. Well, first of all, we're speaking out in a way that recreation organizations typically do not. Recreation-based organizations typically stay silent when it affects potentially their relationship with, say, land managers. So, for example, we work on primarily federal land. Now, I always like to remind people that federal land is our land. It's the commons. It was set aside over 100 years ago for the public to enjoy. To recreate oneself is really the origin of the word to recreate. And thanks to some of our forefathers, we really, as a nation, for a period of time, believed in public lands as being our savior, in a sense. Unfortunately, a lot of public land is used as what they call multi-use, right? The wise use, which is really extraction, mining, right? Harvesting, logging. We as an organization have become much more sensitive to our own impact and the impact that others are having on public lands, and we're speaking out. So as an example, Jim, when a commercial logging project was proposed in a very pristine area of this, in the Green Ridge area of Sisters Country, we actually stood up and said, Forest Service, you are going to take away some of the most beautiful old growth, mature trees that are left in this county. And you're telling people you're doing it for fire resilience, or that you're doing it for, right, mitigation. But we challenged them on that. And that's very unusual. We stood up and said, you're using euphemisms. You're not being transparent with the public. You're going to not only disrupt this very special place, but you're going to essentially extinct the last northern spotted owl that we know of in our area. And we stood up. We said, our voice, we as members are not okay with this type of action. And so the point is, we have to be accountable ourselves, but we also have to be vocal in doing that. Now, there are great examples. Places like Jackson Hole, there's some conservation groups that are recreation oriented who are also speaking out and saying we need to coexist. We need to find ways to make sure that when we're doing things in wild, we're doing it responsibly. That might mean closing corridors to human activity during certain times of year or in general. It might mean making sure that people are aware that when they go backcountry skiing, they shouldn't go here because that's an area where there's sensitive wildlife. So there are ways in which we can speak up and act. It's just not normal for recreation organizations to do that, but very, very important. A lot of organizations out there talk about being sensitive to wildlife and wild places, and they want to preserve nature, but they're really not acting on it when it comes to time to really put their money where their mouth is. And we believe that we are, but not without a lot of pushback, to be honest with you.
How did it turn out with the Forest Service?
So in that particular project, it still has not had a final decision. So they haven't actually logged this 20,000 pristine acres that we're hoping will not be logged. But we have stood up and have shown the Forest Service that we care and that we will not stand by and watch our public lands be disturbed in this way anymore, because it's no longer the right thing to do. It never was the right thing to do, but this whole idea that this was there for harvesting and multi-use, and this is wise use, the game has changed. Where we are today in 2023 is very different than where we were 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, when America thought that this regenerative resource of logging could go on endlessly and everywhere. We now know how important these trees are. We now know how important a wolf is to the ecosystem in our area, and the respect for the wolves that have been reintroduced to Oregon is critical. We need to be a part of that conversation as an organization, because we know that we care about our wild places and our wild lands. We've just not stood up for them for fear that we will lose our ability to work on these public lands with the Forest Service. So it's been a bit of a push-pull. It's been very challenging because we are, through an agreement with the Forest Service, given the ability to put thousands of hours on the trail. That could be revoked if we speak too loudly or in a way that they don't like. So there's some challenges there for sure. Yeah.
It's just like on Humanity Rising, if we put together a program that YouTube and the algorithms that be out there don't consider to be kosher, they can take you down. And if you make more than 2 infractions in 6 months, you can be taken down permanently.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit shocked actually that there would be the same kind of strictures against a small little organization dedicated to the preservation of nature like Sisters Trails. But apparently you have to walk a fine line just like we do here on Humanity Rising.
The power dynamic is present as well. Yeah.
That's extraordinary. That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Let's circle back to the wolf. Because there's been, many indications that the wolf and the wolf packs that were hunted mercilessly for a very long time and were endangered almost everywhere. And then all of a sudden, scientists have come to realize that the apex predator is actually the key to the overall viability of the ecosystem. I mean, who'd have thunk?
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure how much you know about wolves, but tell us what you know about how that all works, where the different large mammals like the wolf are actual and an integral, in fact, essential part to ecosystem viability.
Yeah, well, we were really proud last year at the Sisters Trail Alliance to sponsor a rewilding event conference that occurred in the Metolius Basin last fall, where experts in all different industries came together to speak on rewilding. And so for those of you who don't know what rewilding is, right? Rewilding Earth is bringing back all of those animals and species and giving them place, right? This idea of half Earth, or in America, Biden brought forward the America the Beautiful and 30 by 30. It's bringing 30% water and land back into preservation and conservation. And a lot of people talk about, and at this rewilding conference, talked about how important wolves, as an example, apex predator, is to the natural environment and the ecosystem. And we are really lucky in Sisters, at least we think we're really lucky, that they have reintegrated wolves in Oregon. They've been brought back in, and some have naturally found their way back into our area. And it's so exciting to think that there are wolves that actually we know now with research will increase the mule deer population and the elk population that are dwindling so much, right? Because the way in which the wolves keep the other mammals on their toes, so to speak, they cull the unhealthy, the healthy are thriving. And so we see wolves as a representation of a healthy ecosystem in our area. And so we have spoken out about telling people how important it is. And if everyone realized that their dogs were just descendants of wolves, we wouldn't have such a loathing for wolves. We would actually respect and love them. And there was a tremendous woman from an organization who spoke about living in the woods and tracking wolves for months at a time and having so many close encounters, none of which ended in disaster. There was no incidences, that the wolves were scared of humans. And it would be really great to see us embracing more of those populations, particularly here in the West, where we have such a tremendous opportunity to reintegrate wolves and other species to our ecosystems to create more balance, because they really do. We know they do. From everything from flora, fauna balance comes back when we have them. So there's a lot of smart people who talk about this, particularly in the Northwest, and we're excited to be a part of that, even if it's only tangentially as an organization.
Yeah, and Richard Page in the chat is mentioning how wolves were brought back into Yellowstone, and the same experience happened in Yellowstone. And all the data about the extraordinary way that wolves communicate telepathically,
Right.
over long distances as they hunt their prey, apparently through the limbic system in the brain.
Yeah.
So these aren't just dumb brutes. These are remarkably sophisticated beings, actually. Sentient beings that are as important as we are in their own way, and in many cases far more sophisticated, particularly in terms of mental and psychic clairvoyance and communication. Then you have to be a high level mystic to replicate what they do completely naturally.
Right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, no, we live in a farm community, right? Sisters is not far from a lot of ranching and cattle, and predation is so low, and there's already these funds set up all over the West to take care of ranchers who lose cattle, but the numbers are so low compared to the benefit of reintroducing wolves and allowing them to thrive. And part of our discussion as Sisters Trail Alliance is to also really say, like, because we have to coexist with them, it also means that we can't constantly expand into wilderness. We can't build new trails everywhere and anywhere. And that's been a tough decision for the organization and the board to come to that conclusion, that we have to allow animals to have their space too. We are one with them, but we have to respect the lands that are there. And so it comes out initially as like, you're kind of out of your wheelhouse, but I totally disagree. I believe that for us as humans to thrive and to enjoy the outdoors, we must respect the animals and the flora and fauna in general that's there. I think it's so critical. And we can be the most important voice to preserve and conserve more of those places, especially in this country, because it doesn't take much reading to remember how 100, 150, 200 years ago, this land was roaming full of species. We are the Serengeti. All over the country, we had that. We really do.
Yeah.
And it's time to bring it back. It's part of our heritage, our history, and we need to think about that as something to be proud of. And I'm hopeful that the reintroduction of wolves, and little by little, as we educate ranchers in particular, that they are not a real threat. 90 million bovines in America should be enough, but I guess we want more bovines. But our hope is that the wolf is an example of something that we can support as an organization and help them thrive.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the threat of the mule deer. Talk about the mule deer. Talk about what they are, their niche in the ecosystem. There's been a 60% devastation over the last 10 years. How viable are they right now? What's being done to resuscitate us? So talk about the mule deer.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? I mean, less than 5% of Americans are hunters. They have an outsized voice in America. ODFW, the Oregon Department of Wildlife, is really focused on making sure that we stop the decline of mule deer and elk in the county and in Oregon as a whole, particularly in the county in Central Oregon. We're really seeing major declines. They, like other species, play a super important part in the ecosystem. And what we're seeing is, with growth, right, in wild lands and wild places, expansion, sprawl, when we're seeing fencing continuing to be put up, when we know it should be coming down, when we see recreationists in places like Bend expanding, we're seeing a huge impact on mule deer. Those declines are happening on our watch. And yet it's so hard to get people to understand that we humans are really what's behind it, and that we have to look really closely at our actions and try to make decisions to preserve them. So ODFW and the hunting organization want to preserve them for killing, but hunting plays such a small role in reality in the reduction of their numbers. It's everything else we're doing out there, the logging, the mining, the recreation, the building of roads, the lack of wildlife crossings. We're not building the infrastructure that's necessary to continue to retain those intact corridors. It's really unfortunate because it really is happening on our watch, and it's happening very quickly. And so we're hoping that through, again, speaking up, being considerate, not expanding as much, we can have an opposite effect by little by doing what we can to help mule deer as well.
Yeah. By the way, Kat Haber has put something in the chat saying that Colorado passed the reintroduction of wolves legislation into Western Colorado last year. She testified, and what she added was a meditation of placing decision makers into a mindset of sort of honoring the overall ecology, and countering all this were, of course, the ranchers who are afraid of losing cattle and sheep, and the land managers depend on the goodwill of ranchers to come on their land for managing the land itself. So you have any given decision, there's multiple layers and multiple perspectives on what needs to come together for anything to be passed, particularly in a constructive way.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you're facing the same kind of complexity there in Oregon.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think at the end of the day, I always like to remind people that I think it's something like 80% of Americans would define themselves as environmentalists or conscientious or someone who cares about wildlife and wild places. And if that is truly the case, we need to remind all of us that public lands, federal lands belong to all of us. And the outside voice of ranching and extraction is not 80% of Americans who care about these wild lands and wild places, who care about wolves. Colorado passed because the majority of Coloradoans want to see reintroduction of wolves, but the outside voice of hunters and ranchers is really preventing a successful reintroduction. And that is unfortunate. And everyone here and everyone in America should realize that if you really care about wildlife and wild places, these are the moments you have to stand up and support those reintroductions. Super important. Really important to support organizations in Colorado and elsewhere who are fighting for those wolves, who are fighting for the protections and are shunning wildlife services for killing those wolves when there is a very small percentage of predation, for sure.
Yeah. Now, Mary Thorpe is asking, what actually is a mule deer? How does a mule deer differ from other kinds of deer?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in that respect. It's the majority of the deer that we have in our area is defined as mule deer. And I'm guessing it's some mutation or version of a deer that we have populated in Sister. So I'm sorry, as I'm not an expert in that area, but that's the type of deer that we have in Deschutes County, in that part of Oregon.
Yeah, I probably there's as many varieties of deer as there are, of dogs and all kinds of bees. And, they're just, maybe it's because it looks like a mule.
Right. Yeah, they don't necessarily look like mules. And we have them. I mean, Sisters is such a remarkable place. I think, as one person mentioned in the chat, the three sisters, the hope, faith, hope, and charity, the south, the north, and the middle sister. And that wilderness area is such a beautiful area. And there has always been an abundance of wildlife, which we know is dwindling, but there is still a large presence, right? Northern spotted owls. There's wolves now back in our county. We have mule deer. We have elk. We had a recent sighting of a wolverine. I don't like to celebrate too much of these sightings because I want an abundance of them, right? In fact, more often than not, we're hearing about the cougar killing because it killed someone's dog, or the mountain lion. So we want to celebrate a rewilding of these lands because that's what they deserve. And we humans will benefit from that rewilding. The trickle down of rewilding is so important for the human, more than we really want to recognize. And we really believe in that at the Alliance.
Well, let's talk about rewilding. How would you define rewilding? How do you understand the dynamic of rewilding? Because that's been coming up increasingly around the world in environmental circles, but it's actually quite a new term, and many people aren't familiar with it. So just explain what rewilding is and what Sisters is doing about that.
Yeah, well, certainly I'm no expert in this area, and you're right. The term has been around for a while. Dave Foreman, some may recall, was an incredible man committed to his country in wild places and wild lands. The original founder of Earth First went on to start a number of different organizations, including the Rewilding Institute. And he talked a lot about, with his colleagues, about the reintroduction of species to any given area. So that might be in the case of wolves, as rewilding is bringing in wolves back to an area. It could be rewilding of certain plants to certain other species in any given area. Because again, at one point, America was the Serengeti. We had animals and species everywhere. So whether it's a restoration project to bring back certain riparian life, so fish species, or apex predators, or everything in between, it's bringing back animals, flora and fauna, back into the ecosystem where it once was thriving. And so there's lots of efforts of rewilding of these areas, particularly on public land, because we have so much of it. There's such a huge opportunity in America. And frankly, it can happen everywhere. Farmland that's been, as an example, some people would define rewilding simply as allowing a farm. Your son would know this well as a former organic farmer. You would know that many times you want to leave the farm dormant and you want to allow the natural environment to come back. Rewilding could be as simple as that. It could be turning your, pesticide, chemical-rich garden into a native garden and get rid of all the chemicals and bring native plants and bees back into your front yard. Some people would define that as rewilding. So there's lots of different versions of just coming back to nature and letting nature do its thing. I think that's the way in which I would define rewilding.
Cool. Well, Kat Haber again has put in the chat, the 3 C's of rewilding is the conservation of cores, corridors, and carnivores.
That's right. Yep. That's that's exactly right. Yep. The 3 C's is what a lot of people talk about. And in our case, for example, when we stood up to the Forest Service against the Green Ridge logging project, which they call like the Green Ridge Restoration and Resilience Project or whatever, right? Euphemisms. It was about that. It was like, here we have an intact, relatively intact ecosystem through which mule deer and elk and now wolves are passing through. That's a corridor. We have the carnivores there, and we want to conserve that space for them. But every time man goes in and logs the forest and puts in roads or doesn't take out roads, we're disrupting that corridor, we're disrupting that core. And that is a huge problem. That's really what's leading to the decline of a lot of these mule deer and others in our area. And so we really believed in that. We believe that we can coexist and stop some of these practices, particularly on public land.
Yeah. Well, I didn't fully appreciate the corridor part of the 3 C's until I saw a documentary, I think his latest, by Richard Attenborough. This guy's 93 years old, right? And he's still going strong and producing these unbelievably beautiful documentaries. And I think it was his last one, or one of the latest anyway, was around corridors and how almost all species migrate seasonally. Some, as we all know, over vast distances, from like the North Pole to the equator, and all over, the birds and fishes and whales and mammals, and they've depended for millennia on being able to migrate seasonally so that they have their offspring at the right place with the right temperatures, and then they go north. And if they're not allowed to migrate, it short circuits their very survival mechanisms, which they've evolved over millennia and are embedded in their instincts.
Right.
And but how human habitat encroachment and roads and dams and fences, boundaries of all kinds, have basically trapped most of the remaining wildlife into constrained areas that they're learning to adapt to, and are threatened just because they can't migrate.
Yeah, no, that's right. And that's, if someone said to me, why would you join the Sisters Trail Alliance when you're so passionate about conservation and wildlife and species? And it's because I truly believe that we can be such an important force for change and for these things like rewilding, that if we do not continue to encroach upon or disrupt these wild places, we can be part of the solution to preserving them for future generations and helping re-energize and ignite some of these places with their native species. I mean, we really believe that. It's so important. It can't be left to just people who only care about wolves or only care about coho salmon in the Columbia. Like, we all have to look at this holistically and say, we as humans are all part of this destructive process that's happened. We as humans can help turn it around. But we have to listen to nature to guide us, for sure. And certainly science.
Now, Ellie Stockton has given us the answer as to what is a mule deer. They're called mule deers because their ears look like mule ears.
There we go.
Just for your information, everyone.
I love it.
That's why a mule deer is called a mule deer.
There we go.
By the way, Kat has put something in from David Brower, the great environmentalist, the founder of Friends of the Earth and the Sierra Club, around promoting what he called global CPR, conserve, protect, and restore. And ecological restoration was being widely promoted. Ecological was about restoring the ecological processes, such as making a wetland, but not so concerned with the native species that may have been lost. Rewilding instead is about wilderness restoration, restoring wilderness with native species and processes. So rewilding comes from wilderness recovery, and allowing nature to resuscitate itself in its own way. So, for example, as we all know, we are always trying to get the weeds out of the garden. Well, those weeds are what nature generates when it's starting the pathway of recovery. So when we're cutting the weeds down because we want the certain kind of grass to grow, we're eliminating nature's millennia-old evolutionary way of rewilding itself.
Right. Yeah, and that's why I love that example. It can be as basic as something in your front yard, and it can be large landscape conservation efforts that rewilding. And it's interesting that if we go back thousands of years, we'll see that sustainable hunting works. Like, it actually can work. Like, there's people who would say, well, big part of the problem and the loss of these animals is the hunting. And in fact, it's not necessarily the case. It's about, it's the equilibrium that has to be brought into the equation that's respecting the natural processes. And it actually allows for a lot of things like hunting, believe it or not. But it's this all or nothing approach that we're really struggling with in this country in particular. It's like, no, we don't want wolves, or, we don't want this or we don't want that. They can't be part of our shared ecosystem, but it is really important, really, really important.
Yeah. And then a question about the Sisters Trail Alliance. What are the largest obstacles that you folks have faced, and how did you cope with them? And did you have any breakthroughs that you'd want to share with our community?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Probably the biggest obstacle is the reality that we as an organization, a nonprofit that puts thousands of hours on our trail system for the public and in partnership with the Forest Service, is also the same organization that if we push too hard on some of our preservation and conservation beliefs, could revoke our ability to work on the public lands, right? We could lose what's called our VSA, our volunteer service agreement could be lost. And therefore, one of our challenges is to people who've been supporting the organization for a long time, who fear that by pushing back against the Forest Service, we could lose our ability to manage these trails in wild areas. And that would be a huge loss for everyone. And my belief is that because the public lands are our lands, that we have to push back, that we have to, because as many Forest Service, BLM managers will say, they're working on behalf of the public. They are servants of the public. Guilford Pinchot would tell you 120 years ago that he was a servant of the American people when he was managing our forests. And it's really important that we as a public remind them that that is truly the case. And we should be able to work together in this tough love environment for the benefit of the environment. And so walking that delicate dance is really hard, but it provides a tremendous opportunity. If I were to say that the biggest thing that could potentially come out of our work at STA is that we encourage other trail organizations or recreation organizations to challenge the land managers in the same way for the benefit of wilderness and wild places, we could have a total movement where we, not oil and gas, mining, or ranchers, really control public lands for the benefit of the entire public, as opposed to these small groups who have an outside voice on public lands and have frankly been the biggest destruction to those lands, those industries.
Now, Sisters Trails Alliance is aspiring to become national, right?
We're aspiring at the moment to inspire others to do the work that we're doing. We're not sure yet whether, as an organization, without a rebranding or a repositioning, we could go national. But we're looking at trying to create a model that could go national. And maybe that means that we have a stamp of approval, so to speak, right? A 1% for the planet stamp that says, this is how we manage trails. This is how we, do the right thing for nature at the same time that we recreate in nature. And that, to me, seems like the potential model for growth in that way.
Right. So it's modeling something that will be replicated as opposed to organizationally scaling, like Friends of the Earth or Sierra Club, which has all kinds of other challenges, because whenever you go from local to regional to national to global, that pathway, boy, is littered with casualties.
No, that's right. And the compromises that these large organizations have to make these days has unfortunately really compromised the effort itself. And so that's where we're still trying to navigate where we can have the most impact. We talk a lot about impact and where our efforts are best spent. And so that's something that we're looking at right now.
Well, just on this point of the compromises that these big organizations make, I still remember and occasionally refer to the experience that we all had in 2009 with the Copenhagen Conference of Parties on climate change, where we thought Obama's coming in And this is the moment when the world is going to do something. And Copenhagen happened. Not only did nothing happen, but Obama went there and kind of shredded the protocols that had been laboriously negotiated over many, many years and put everything on a voluntary system. And the world climate movement, as it were, still hasn't recovered from debacle of Copenhagen. And one of the things that I was not aware of going in, but became amply evident coming out, was that the major environmental organizations that were involved with Copenhagen were in on it. And they were in on it because the major fossil fuel corporations had been carefully cultivating the Friends of the Earth and the Sierra Clubs and the National Defense Resource Defense Council and other mainstream environmental organizations, so that they were supporting major parts of their annual budget. So when
it's a perverse relationship, unfortunately, that exists.
And so the complexities of operating at that level, just like you at a local level, if you go too far to the left or the right, you can have your permit revoked, and then you can't do anything.
That's right.
And so you're navigating a path with narrow constraints on both sides.
No, that's right. And I look to, believe it or not, I'm sure some of the people here today will be familiar with, Patagonia as a business has done incredible things. And one of the things they did was they started 1% for the planet. And one of the ideas behind that was to donate money to really small and scrappy nonprofits that ultimately they are the ones who really get things done at the ground level. And I really believe in that. And that's why we're trying to figure out not to scale up our organization, but to create more of a model for others to replicate at scale on the ground in different places, hoping that they too will understand how important our role is in the preservation of the outdoor environment and nature in particular.
By the way, quick question from Harriet Crosby, who wants to know more about the wildlife services killing hundreds of thousands of predators and apex species, which used to be called ADC, the Animal Damage Control. What do you know about this wildlife services, and how are they operating, for example, in Central Oregon?
Oh, it's terrible. It is a great example of euphemism of it sounds like it's an organization that's set up to do good things for wildlife, right? Wildlife services. But in fact, it's quite the opposite. The example I can give, or what I would share with people, is to read a really great book by Christopher Ketchum called This Land. It probably came out a few years ago, and he really chronicles what's happening on public lands and talks a lot about organizations that are having negative effect on our lands. It's literally tens of millions of animals are killed every year by wildlife services. It's primarily for the benefit of ranchers, where they go out and kill bears, wolves, cougars, mountain lions, and other animals. And they kill plenty of people's dogs and everyone else along the way through poisoning and trapping. It's really an unfortunate scenario because it looks to be something that is a benefit, but instead is something that's really just serving the self-interest, the interests of a small number of people in the West in particular. And so, caution to the wind here that wildlife services is not what it sounds like. And this is all of those things that we have to wake up to in America, to how our federal lands are being managed and by whom and why and how we should really stand up to some of that.
Well, good, Scott. One final question before we bring our program to a close here. What has been your greatest learning and your greatest joy in the work that you're doing with Sisters Trails Alliance?
I guess I've come to a point in my life where I feel it's really important that each and every one of us plays a role in what one may say a rewilding of Mother Earth, or coming back and doing something for nature in a way that we don't think we have the power to do. And I really believe that it's really important that we do it. I really think about our children and our grandchildren, and it's like, what legacy do we want to leave? And as a former, I raced bikes and have competed all over, and I did all these great things. And I realized that ultimately our relationship to Mother Earth is the most important, and we have a legacy to leave. And I want to know that I was on the right side of history doing good work. And I can do it even in a place where I have passion, which is in the outdoors. It doesn't mean that I have to be an environmentalist or conservationist all in all to have impact and to be helpful or to do good things. We can do it in our own way. We just have to be really educated on how and what we're supporting. And so, I'm really proud of the work that we do. And it's been an interesting arc of education, but it feels good when you have positive impact.
Yeah, I think that's a noble point to make, that in the end, as Eldridge Cleaver said back in the 60s, you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem.
Right.
And in our world right now, with all the trains coming in at once and climate change spinning out of control, every choice that we make is either contributing to the solution or contributing to the problem. And as you're indicating, as you have been doing there in Central Oregon, being able to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and know that you're contributing to the solution in the end is one of the core virtues in a very crisis-laden world.
Yeah.
And so, Scott, I really want to applaud what you're doing, and hope that Sisters Trails Alliance flourishes, under your leadership and that of others, and that I hope you win the case with the Forest Service trying to log these pristine forests. I mean, come on, man, that should be so obvious that you don't do that.
Yeah.
You don't do that. So all strength to your arm, as they say, and then we'll be glad to follow your work and then have you back down the trail.
That would be great. Well, thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here today, and good luck with everything. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Scott. And that'll do it for us for today, everyone. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. You also received it in your reminder from Zoom. So you're welcome to join the after chat. And then we'll see you all here tomorrow for our next session of Humanity Rising. Thank you, Scott.
Right on.
Well done. Bye, everyone.